Okay, so what I'm going over here are the steps for completing the cash flow statement, and this is a partial cash flow statement, and you're only doing operating activities. That's all you're doing is operating activities, okay? So the way that this works is you're adding and subtracting numbers within financial statements. And the reason why you do this is, let me give you a little example here. So let's just do like a really miniature income statement. I'm going to show you an example here. Okay, income statement. So we know that revenue is what comes in, right? So let's just say we have a service revenue of, oh, I misspelled that. Service revenue of $500,000, right? Okay. And then let's just say that we only had one expense. Let's just pretend that we had one expense only, okay? And that expense was depreciation. So depreciation expense, let's just say it was $50,000. Okay. So this would mean that our net income would actually be $500,000 in minus $50,000 out. So our net income would be $450,000. So that makes sense, right? Yeah. I mean, by this point, that should be second nature for you. Now, here's the reality, though. Just because our net income is $450,000, that really doesn't give us a clear picture of where we generated our cash, right? Because depreciation expense is actually not an actual expense, right? I mean, our cash does not change for depreciation expense. It's something that we do through the accounting process in order to quote unquote true up our books. Remember we talked about that? So what happens is that if we look at this net income of $450,000, that $450,000 is not a representation of our cash, what we generated our cash. So the purpose of the cash flow statements is to kind of figure out where you've generated your cash from. So what you do is you go through a process of adding and subtracting numbers based on what your financials are at the end of the period. So in this case, what would happen is that, okay, so we know that part, right? So let me then show you the process for completing the cash flow statement. And this is for operating activities. So if you look in your book, you're going to see that there are operating activities, financing and investing, there's 3 different steps. So we're only going to be doing step 1. And the way that you start this process is you start with, I'm not going to put the titles in yet. I'm just going to tell you the numbers. You start with the net income, and that would be the number you start with. Then you're going to add for depreciation expense. Let me change that. You're going to add for depreciation expense. I'm just going to stop right there for 1 second. So if we were looking at this statement up above that I did, this kind of fake statement, we would start with the net income of $50,000, right? And then we would add back the $50,000 that is the depreciation expense. So if this was our only financial that we had here, what we would be saying is that the cash generated from operating activities was $500,000. Now, of course, we have way more things happening than just one item of depreciation expense, right? So I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of the, why we do some of the entries, but there's a really great video in Wiley Plus that goes over it. So we might look at that today just to kind of help you with that. Okay, so that's just more of kind of like a little description of it. So now let's go back to looking at the process for completing, okay? So we start with the net income. We're then going to add for any depreciation expense. We're going to add for any loss. We're going to subtract for any gain. And of course, you would either have a gain or a loss. You wouldn't have both. We are then going to add for a decrease in any receivable. So this would be accounts receivable, notes receivable, etc. Okay. Or we are going to subtract for an increase, and this will make more sense when we start doing it. Okay? Just write down the information out. We're going to subtract for an increase in any receivable. Okay. The next step is you're going to add for a decrease. Oops. Going to add for a decrease in inventory. Or you're going to subtract for an increase in inventory. You're then going to add for a decrease in prepaid expense. Or you're going to subtract for an increase in prepaid expense. Then you're going to add for an increase in any payables. So that would be accounts payable, interest payable, salaries and wages payable, any payable. Or you're going to subtract for a decrease in any payable. Okay. So those are the steps in the process. Now, all of these here, you're going to see all of the items that I have here on the screen that are the assets. You're going to see that for the assets, you're going to do the opposite. So what I mean by that is you'll notice here where it says decrease, you add, increase, you subtract. So you're kind of doing the opposite, right? For the liabilities, do the same. So you'll notice down here for the liabilities that if it's an increase, you add. If it's a decrease, you subtract. Okay. All right. So those are the rules. I'm going to give you a second to write those rules down. I'm going to correct my spelling here. Okay, so let me give you a second here to write those down. I will stop the recording and then start a new recording for us to get into the PowerPoint.